just did. But also, one of the main objectives of the conference is to have interesting conversation ongoing between the delegates. And the design of this panel discussion is essentially to spark cause, to get those conversations ongoing. So the first panel discussion is on actually the theme of the conference: university, industry, government interactions in a time of turbulence. So now, we live, I think, in uncertain times. Now, you may challenge that. You may say that, change always happens. And stability is but an illusion. But I think you have to admit that there are some major changes that are currently ongoing in the broader macro environment. I refer to the 2016 EU referendum here in Britain, the 2016 presidential election in the United States, and global geopolitics just feel very volatile at the moment. Now, this may be a particularly Anglo-American Eurocentric worldview, one can argue, one can suggest. And it will be interesting to hear the panelists' view on this. I mean, if you are, for example, from India, China, or Ghana or Nigeria, it may feel that business is pretty much as usual. But that's something which is that the case? I mean, is it something which is limited to Anglo-Saxon economies, or are the reverberations felt on a global scale? So to discuss these issues, we have a very interesting panel assembled here. We have just heard from Professor John Bessant. He doesn't need any further introduction. We have with John, sitting next to John, Professor Mohammed Saad. He is the Professor of Innovation and Technology Management in University of West of England. The interesting thing about Mohammed's work is that he has focused on UIG linkages primarily in a developing country context. So I think if our discussion tend to become too Eurocentric, I think Mohammed's perspective would be a necessary correction in relation to that. Mohammed has also extensively written on university, industry, government collaborations, linkages. He has also led in Europe, has been associated with many EU-funded projects. One that I was part of in 2008, 2009, he led the Bosphore GMES package, which was led by West of England. And he was the lead investigator, and I was fortunate to be a part of that. So he has got extensive experience, and he can bring that perspective onto the discussion. We also have very fortunate to have Rozana Himaz. She's got a PhD from Cambridge. Her latest book is called Austerity: 100 Years of Fiscal Squeezing.
In the US, in the UK actually.
In the UK. Yes. So it's published by Oxford University Press. And Rozana will talk a bit about how the funding subsystem is getting affected by what's happening in the macro environment. I mean, the conventional wisdom is that it will be adversely affected, but that's something perhaps Rozana will contest. And then last but not least, we have Karl Johnson.
Kjelstrup Johnson.
Karl Johnson. He's from School of Architecture in Oxford Brookes. Karl has extensive industry experience. He's an entrepreneur himself, and he is leading some very interesting initiatives in the business initiative in the university to develop linkages with the industry. And so Karl will, I think, will talk a bit about those initiatives and also bring his perspective on the conference, on the panel theme. Okay, so the format is that each of the panelists will talk about 5 to 10 minutes, and after the first round, they'll have the opportunity to respond to each other's comments, and I may also have a few questions at that point in time, and after that we'll invite questions from the audience. Okay. So can I start with you, Rozana, and get your perspective?
Yes, thank you, Surja. First of all, let me just say that I was absolutely fascinated by John's keynote speech. It was, I'm an economist, and it was, I think it was way back at university as an undergraduate that I had actually studied a little bit about innovation and then not much after that. But one of the key questions John's very inspiring talk sort of left in me, one of the key questions I wanted to ask was about this issue of funding and financing such innovative projects. And when you're talking of any UIG interaction, something that becomes very important to discuss is the role of the government, particularly in turbulent times. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about what government spending might mean to university-based or to government-based funding of projects and government spending and what that would mean to this interaction in turbulent times. Now, turbulent times are nothing particularly new. So if I just look at the case of the UK, for instance, right now we are in a world where Brexit is pretty important, and as you said, the US presidential election means that adds to the turbulence of the times. But turbulent times aren't particularly, aren't something new. You had, for instance, if you just look at the past 100 years in the UK, you had the two world wars being times of great turbulence. You had lots and lots of currency episodes of currency crisis, including the most recent currency crisis in 2008, leading to the Great Depression and the ensuing austerity policies. You had the 1930s depression. You had the massive Geddes Acts of the 1920s, where public spending was slashed by 3 percentage points of GDP a year, which is remarkably high. So there have been times before in UK's history where times have been very turbulent, and the response of the government during these times has to be to cut back quite sharply on spending. Now, what can you actually see if you go back in history? What sort of patterns can you see in terms of how the government cut spending and how it evolved over time? One of the key things I think that is very relevant to today's times is to notice that the very early cuts in the 1920s, the 1930s, even to some extent the 1970s when we joined the EU and then we had a big exchange rate crisis. If you look at those times, the cuts have been very sharp, but relatively short-lived. 1 year, 2 years, the Geddes Acts was for 3 years. In contrast, you notice the cuts during the Thatcher period, the John Major period, and even the more recent austerity episode that we had under the coalition government. Here the cuts are more shallow, but they just last a longer time. 7 years, 8 years maybe. So there's a distinct change in the way austerity seems to be happening. Now, if the current government's response to turbulence, or indeed the period after, say 5 years from now, 10 years from now, is cutting back on spending, if past trends were to continue, I suppose one of the things that would probably happen is that the cuts are going to be shallower, but they're going to last a long time. So an interesting question then is, what does this mean to university funding? What does this mean for innovation? What does this mean, if I were to borrow a particular phrase from your talk, John, how do we reset and revise in terms of our research strategy? How do we move forward if government cuts, if they do happen, are going to be shallower, but if they're going to last a longer time? A second point is that whether we should really be worried a lot about UK government's potential cutbacks in terms of spending. If you look at UK's history, there is a serious austerity, a deliberate austerity episode happening once in a decade. So austerity will come back. It hasn't gone away. It will come back. It might not come back the next year or the year after, but it will come back. That's how the trend has been for the past 100 years. But should we really be that worried? Because if we look at the post-Great Depression, that is the 2008 crisis, that period, if we look at the coalition cuts, there were certain expenses that were ring-fenced. And education and health was one of them. So would it be possible then that our government, being advised by intelligent people, would it be possible that education spending might be saved somehow, and the cuts might not be as severe as cuts in other areas? So that's something to think about. But then I think what's more important is not to worry about the funding or the sources of funding that much now that we are leaving the EU as well. But what we perhaps need to think then is, what are the alternative sources of funding? What are the other ways in which we can perhaps even get commercial value for our innovation and research? And not just research perhaps in terms of the value added that it adds to society, which obviously we cannot deny, but maybe something that we need to really think of seriously is, how do we then fund this innovation and fund this research, especially during a time when cuts in spending are likely to happen, perhaps not affect education spending that much, but nonetheless we will not be perhaps getting as much as funding from the EU as we have done before. So how do we then face a world where research funding perhaps might be cut back to some extent at least?
John?
Well, I've really had my sort of long chance to say some things. So just some brief thoughts for the panel. Before I went down to Exeter, I had a role at Imperial coordinating a large, one of the EPSRC's grand challenges. This was called Innovation and Productivity. And we had 5 universities and about 30 researchers. And the question was very simple, and it was really driven by the Treasury. Are we getting enough bang for our buck or our pound? At that time, we were spending in the UK about £23 billion funding research. And the question is, do we get any return on that investment? And of course, those of us in universities realised part of the challenge of the REF is not about measuring our productivity as researchers in an academic way. It's, is it worth putting public money into all of this? So what we were trying to do was broadly look at the innovation and productivity challenge, the connection between research and what comes out the other end. And of course it isn't, as I've implied, a nice simple linear thing. It happened at the time when open innovation was just coming on the agenda. So a lot of the research, which we did write up in a book, but a lot of the research was picking up early forays into that space. But if I just give a couple of the headlines from that particular program, and of course it needs updating because we finished that sort of 2008. But basically, number one, for universities, we're talking about a long frontier. One of the dangers is we got very seduced by the US model that universities are really all about spin-offs, and that's the big way in which we'll make an impact on the economy. It's a tiny, even in the US, it's not a big part of the story. That most of what goes on in universities is along a much broader frontier, much longer frontier. And in particular, one of the key ways universities have always had a huge impact is by educating students. So we should recognise that fact. And thankfully we are beginning now to rethink teaching, but actually recognise that's a huge opportunity to get inside the heads. And Mohammed and I were talking last night, I now come across students of mine who are now sort of middle age and beyond, who are in very senior positions, but do remember things there and make a connection. So if we're looking to make an impact, one of the things we already have, but maybe we don't amortize as much as we could, is this very deep set of relationships which are established at undergraduate level and beyond. The point I made about knowledge spaces, Alan Hughes I think coined it beautifully, the idea of universities having that kind of not only responsibility but the authority. Very few other places can convene a kind of neutral space, but universities can. So if you're going to have an honest experimental facility, university may well be the organizer, not necessarily the doer of it all, but the catalyst. There's therefore a responsibility for universities, though, to experiment, not to be lazy and sort of copy. And one of our partners in the research was the Association of UK Technology Transfer Officers. They've obviously changed their names, but essentially the professional body for those people in universities managing the liaison. In a sense, not just replicating a standard model, but playing on the fact we've got some 200 odd institutions, we could have lots of varieties and then pick the crop, cream of that crop. There is a slightly personal concern. We still are very technology push, and I'm an engineer, I'm as guilty as the rest. But I think many of our models for thinking about the way universities could contribute to the story are tech push. And actually the whole design thinking, the engagement with users, the understanding of that, and then creating ways of bringing that message in was another important part of our findings. And something which I think is quite important, we're seeing a lot more of training people at universities, training university staff and research and so on, how innovation happens, rather than allowing them to default to very old-fashioned models, and increasingly how entrepreneurship happens, and the two are sides of the same coin. So actually building a knowledge inside. If I then flip across to the government part of the story, we had some messages there. There's this huge debate, should government get involved with innovation at all, blah, 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 blah. But I think probably as little as possible, but in very specific ways. Catalyze connections is the phrase I wrote down here. And that's what governments have increasingly been good at doing. It's cheaper, but it also can enable all sorts of things to happen, particularly that all sort of get something started and then the market will sort of pick up the momentum if there's something useful there. So Peter and I were talking about business links and so on, but there was a very good program around innovation advisors in the business links. They were catalysts, they were connectors, and bringing that up to date, there are other ways in which government can play that kind of role. Demonstrators and visibility. Again, years back, one of the most successful programs when we had a Department of Trade and Industry was a program called Inside UK Industry, Inside UK Enterprise, whatever. It was basically industrial tourism. Basically, there would be a factory, some business doing something rather well, prepared to show and sometimes receiving government money to be a demonstrator, and then busloads of other managers would come along. Now, if you look at all we know about diffusion of innovation, one of the key things is what Everett Rogers called homophily. We believe people like us. So the worst person to try and introduce a new technique to a company is someone from a university, because we're from two different worlds and nobody trusts the other side. The best way is someone like us. And this was a government scheme which was relatively cheap, but enormously influential in terms of shaping, building the connections around which new things could happen. And the last thing from that listening, inside government itself, we kind of assume they don't innovate. But if ever there was a space where they're under huge pressure, not least to adapt to the kind of crisis conditions, it is thinking innovation in the public sector. We don't really have, there have been several sort of attempts to get it off the ground, but we don't really in the UK have something that the Danes, for example, do rather well. There's an organisation called MindLab. And MindLab is owned by the Ministries of Employment, Economic Affairs and Taxation, so not necessarily the bits you'd normally think were the innovators. And MindLab has two roles. It's to do research on new models for public sector innovation, and they have a big practical PhD program around that. But the other is to train and get debates going around public servants to raise their understanding and awareness, and to give them a space where they can refer back to in Copenhagen, they can come and they can think about innovation. So those were the sort of headlines from that program, and hopefully a little bit more fuel.
Mohammed?
I probably would like to bring the discussion to developing countries. And turbulences have always existed and affected developing countries. Whether they have been managed, that's another thing. I mean, we know, we were talking last night about turbulences and impact on many colleagues from developing countries not being able to join us because their visa was not granted. But that's something. I would like to probably come to, I'll take the idea that John has beautifully put forward, the need for innovation, for a new innovation model. And I'm just thinking, John, whether this new innovation model in the context of developing countries would probably bring us to what the School of Appropriate Technology in the 70s were putting forward, and everybody was rejecting their ideas because developing countries were more interested by gadget and technology push that they would buy for quite a lot of money and end up not being efficiently utilized because the capabilities are not there or were not there, and probably they are still not there. So if we talk about innovation model, we probably have to say, well, we need also to think about a new model for the production of knowledge. A new model for the production of knowledge in developing countries, which is linked to their need, to their requirement, to their context. I think the context which you have put forward is also quite important. The context means that you can't just import or buy any gadget from anywhere and expect to use it in your country or in your company, as appropriately as possible. And this also takes us to, think about the links, the turbulence, and its impact on the links between the university and its partners. Because thinking about an innovation model, thinking about a new model for teaching and probably researching, but let's call it model for production of appropriate knowledge. It means that you also have to think about the impact of these turbulences on the whole, all the stakeholders that are involved in that innovation models. So that would bring us to the national, let's talk about the national system of innovation. It's funny that sometimes I hear that, for instance, when we're working on Algeria, where I come from, I hear scholars saying there is no national system of innovation in Algeria, which for me is wrong. Now, there are things missing, or the national system of innovation is not well managed. So we need to think how this turbulence affect the national system of innovation, and how that national system of innovation can be more effective without having to probably copy models which are more difficult. How the turbulence affect the production of the capabilities. Because I'm very fond, and I really believe that the innovative capacity of a country is dependent on its capabilities. The work of Cohen and Levin too, the absorptive capacity. So what sort of knowledge do we have to develop in order to have a specific or appropriate innovation model? And I would really like to bring this. Probably I will try through my presentation this afternoon to raise a few issues about developing countries, where quite a lot of developing countries are still adopting a control system, a centralized system. Is that still appropriate to manage the national system of innovation? Is it the appropriate one? Isn't it impeding entrepreneurship, etc.? And I'll probably just throw these ideas to the audience to see their point of view. I would also I think it's important in developing countries because for a very long time, just like in developed country, we have for a very long time grown up with the idea that if you have knowledge, you have the power. So do you really want to share your knowledge and lose your power? And this is something quite strong in developing countries. And this idea of sharing, collaboration, working together, is still not there in quite a lot of these contexts, which have to be looked at specifically, depending on their context. Each context is unique, rather than just trying to, take a model, copy it, and try to sort something which is bound to fail.
Thanks. Karl.
Yeah, thank you, and really, really interesting points. And I think I'd like to pick off as sort of new models for innovation. And certainly I find my experience while studying, I was also engaged in the industry, and found that there was this often a massive cavernous gap between academia and industry. And what seems to be evident there is, well, the academic environment and the university follows a 14th century model where bachelors you get to hear about the book, masters you get to master the book, doctor you get to doctor the book, and professor you get to profess the doctored book. So first of all, I think the key here would be beginning to break down those silos. And I think certainly paradigm shifts in terms of technology and convergence means that as a representative of the School of Architecture within a campus, I have the capacity to be here sat on the panel in terms of the business school, or talk about biomimicry without necessarily having a biology degree. And I think the key here is about actually opening up the conversation, and I think that harks back to John's presentation earlier. So how would that work, and how would that be assessed in a university environment? That's one big key. And I suppose the assessment, there's peer-to-peer assessment, and that's going to take a while, a transition period before that begins to be an accepted norm. But I'm really keen in certainly understanding the role of the architect. So for instance, my background's in architecture, and we're quite, I suppose, we're T-shaped in a sense. We've got breadth, but we focus in specific areas. And we engage design thinking, it's complex adaptive systems thinking, it is a business. I'm very keen, certainly in a domain where I'd say I'm working more entrepreneurial in terms of within the system, to try to ask the question, what would it be if you took an architect and placed them within a business school? What would it be if you took an architect and started asking those questions in terms of the medical environment? And that's something I've personally been involved in. So taking architectural approaches and looking at medical environments or apparel or sports elements, to set up a company called SkinGraph, using technologies within that environment and deploying it within a different domain. I'm also about to embark on a PhD, and that's going to be in defence and disaster. But again, really it doesn't start till April, so touch base in a few years, we'll see how I'm carrying on. But the idea here is that if I can take this thinking and deploy it within a different domain, how would that change? And I suppose the questions I would have would be, what level of fluidity and flexibility within those domains that are intrinsically quite siloed in their educational environment, how fluid would they be to these new ideas? And what would be the markers for acceptance? Classically, there's a gravitas that certainly I'm below in terms of the panel here, and it's a great privilege to be studied it. But I think it's about having this ability to create this cross-pollination, cross-conversation. And yeah, I think certainly I've been involved now in leading strategy for developing the apprenticeship scheme for the School of Architecture, and the approach that we're taking there is to focus on knowledge, skills and behaviour, but actually create a, I suppose, shared research development schema where the we'll be developing partnerships with external companies, and we would co-developing IP. Now, we're not quite sure what that means in terms of the legal aspect, but the fact that the university becomes, to John's comment before, sort of a space to rethink, an opportunity for not only education, but learning and continuous learning. So again, instead of breaking these sort of clear, defined segments, actually talk about it in terms of paralleled learning as opposed to education and training. And the industry is shifting, technology is coming about, AI is going to be here in 5 years or 10 years or however long, but there's likely to be a requirement for upskilling or retraining. It doesn't necessarily mean those individuals in those positions will have to learn AI, but they will have to have some understanding of what AI, for instance, will bring, and the next convection current of innovators or thinkers that are coming through the discipline.
That's great, thank you. I think we didn't intend to, but I think there is remarkable similarity in terms of the views expressed. I mean, Rozana started by saying that yes, the macro environment seems more uncertain now. There is a fear of, if you're living in the present, it may seem that the world has turned upside down. Funding can be cut off. But as she rightly takes a historical perspective, says austerity is nothing new. And there will be challenges but opportunities as well. I mean, John's, your talk was fascinating. I mean, you talked about this large project, which actually I looked up before, this large project which you led in UCL, I think, or Imperial. And the findings that you shared, I think kind of supports Rozana's view that, one is that the funding subsystem may not be that affected, but even if it gets affected, university should not be too much worried about, because in a way you are advocating to going back to the old role, the teaching, let's do the teaching well. In that way we are contributing to the national innovation system. And I think it's quite a pushback to some of the new ideas, for example, triple helix theory, or the triple helix model, which explicitly suggests that universities should be more entrepreneurial. It should pursue the US model, the Bayh-Dole Act. We should have something similar here in the UK, and that's the route to go down. So I think rightly you pushed back against that notion, and you also talked about problem with technology push, and this is kind of also challenging the notion that basic science has to be done at the university. And university should come up with new ideas, and then there is technology pushed into the industry. And then following from there, I think what Mohammed was saying very rightly is that developing countries have sometimes, policymakers in developing countries have sometimes, perhaps a bit uncritically, accepted these models which are based on Western experiences. So the linear model, you have basic research, ideas generated, industry implements them, and then they sell it to the consumers. The linear model, which actually is not the reality as your talk rightly pointed out, but many policy makers in developing countries have perhaps quite uncritically tried to adopt or pursue that model, not with much success. And I think Mohammed was suggesting that there is a need to have a new model based on the realities of developing countries, a new model of knowledge production. And quite interestingly, the stuff that you were talking about, Karl, I mean, they do not need massive basic science research. And you are talking about cross-pollination, networking, cross-learning, and that's something I think John highlighted as well in his talk. So I think there is, but I think, I mean, having said that, I mean, is that an issue? I mean, if we do not focus on basic science, the linear model has been much critiqued, but the fact that we still talk about the linear model kind of suggests the persistence of the idea as well. And then if the idea has persisted for a very long time, there potentially may be some value there. So maybe maybe you'd like to respond to each other's comments, and then we'll invite questions from the audience.
So can I just quickly respond to what Karl was saying? This idea about bringing an architect, putting him or her into the business school, doing this sort of interdisciplinary research, it's quite an important idea, it's quite a catchy idea, but again, if you think of what sort of the role of the government in this sort of thing, is what the UK government currently, what it does, is it actually stifling people's incentives to do that? Say the current context of the ref. Now, I'm someone who fearlessly embarked in interdisciplinary research together with a political scientist, and I think we've just done some wonderful work for the past 6 years. It took 6 years, so beyond the ref 5-year period. Now, when it comes to the ref, when it comes to journals, our journals are still very much unidisciplinary. So where do you put this wonderful new articles, new finding, or where do you publish it? And is what the government's doing, is it just making sure that these older ways of thinking, while it sort of pays lip service in ESRC and funding bodies to say we encourage interdisciplinary research, in reality you're penalized for doing it. It can be a complete career crash if you actually do this. But some of the systems haven't aligned. And if you look at Mohammed's point about developing countries and knowledge being power, is what is happening there, does that require a new model of innovation, or is what is required simply more government intervention such that property rights are clearly defined, so that knowledge continues to be power even when you share it? Is that the issue there, that the government isn't somehow providing the incentive structures? Is it an issue about regulation? Is it more about rules? So that the government provides incentive structures so that even when you share your knowledge, you can still internalize as an individual or as a community, commercially perhaps, in terms of money perhaps, or some other gain, some other return, you can internalize some of the value that you put out. Is that the problem? So do we actually need a new innovation model, or is it simply that we need property rights better defined in developing countries at least?
Anybody else would like to respond to?
So you want me to respond?
No, to any of the comments, which has been, otherwise we'll invite questions from the audience.
A quick comeback. I sat on two of the pre-ref panels when it was still called the REE, and then I've been a victim of ref panels since then. I think it's a real distortion, frankly, in terms of what we're trying to achieve. And I go back to our grand challenge where the Treasury was really pushing that. Actually, what we've generated is this wonderful system for producing more and more esoteric articles, speaking to fewer and fewer people. I think my only sort of words of comfort would be impact is going to change that. The reason we didn't measure impact in the earlier assessments was we didn't know how to. The easy thing to do is count patents in innovation research, or amongst academics count papers. That's easy, so we'll do it. It's much harder because you've got to trace time series and so on. Much harder to get impact, but we're getting better at it. And you notice with the next ref, it's going to be more and more impact. Because what I'm seeing, and what I think increasingly the commentary is showing, is there isn't much correlation between the 4-star paper and the 4-star impact. And not least because the world's problems are cross-disciplinary. So actually, and as someone who agrees with you, I think that may be something which will eventually sort itself out. The tragedy is it's been a real distortion of some great sort of thinking time that's been spent. I'm showing my prejudice here, but but hopefully it will sort it out. I think some countries are lucky they haven't yet gone through a ref process, so if they do, they might sort of pick up on the 21st century model rather than that older one. But, small comment.
Okay. Questions from the audience? Would like to, Nicolette?
So you pick up on something that's dear to my heart about structural issues within the sector, and probably touched on that in the later panel discussion about entrepreneurial universities. But then coming back to the key word, which is industry and government in this session, and the ref, and I wonder the extent to which any of the panel have any confidence in the early signs of what's happening with the KEF, so the KEF, the Knowledge Exchange Framework, as trying to sort of balance back again what we're doing, and whether we think that's going to be effective, and if so, what it needs to actually measure or incentivise us to do in order for that to be effective. If you haven't engaged in it, then perhaps that's not a question you can answer. Because there's consultation.
We'll take a couple of questions together and then.
Can I just go back on what people were talking about with regard to funding?
Yeah.
In the late 60s, early 70s, after the Trend report, there was a lot of discussion about whether research grants should be awarded on the basis of the great and good recommendation. And think tanks were asked, London Research Institutes, were asked, whether there should be other criteria. What would the panel, anyone on the panel, suggest as being suitable criteria for judging whether or not to fund some application for fundamental knowledge research. I don't mean making slightly better apps. I mean about how you decide between different sorts of application for money. What criteria would you suggest for new knowledge requests?
Maybe John, I think because you've been involved with
Yeah. It's a really great question. I guess, first of all, I take some slight issue. Fundamental, I put in big inverted commas.
I agree.
Because the kind of default is that it's got to be pure science, and that's got to be, and then already you're into a very narrowly disciplined focus. I think it's not all a history of failure, and I think one of the things about the grand challenges, when John O'Reilly of EPSRC, the chairman of the research councils, coined the grand challenge, he said, I want research that rises above the noise, which I thought was really nice, because in a sense what he was saying was, the question you're raising, so as a criterion, does this rise above the noise? And what I would then add to that is a sort of integrated view. How does this challenge play out in the world? Because that's going to bring a user dimension in. It's not simply going to be technology push. And I think some of the grand challenges have been doing that. There was one I was aware of on regenerative medicine. Now, that's a hugely interesting and very cross-disciplinary thing, because at one level it's seriously about how do we make organs, which is all about clever genetic techniques and medical research. On the other hand, it's hugely about ethics, and it's going to be about economics. So actually, it's a wonderful grand challenge for dealing with something that society is going to need. Otherwise, we're just going to have this thing hit us, and we go. So that would be my take, that actually there was a lot of good in the thinking around grand challenges. And we try to do this in the humanitarian sector. We have a kind of miniature version. There are lots of donors, and quite a lot of money in the Rockefeller and some of these other pockets. They're very concerned to fund the right things. Gates would be a good example. It's got to be good. They're quite interested in the notion of challenge funding, where you articulate a story that's much bigger than a narrow specific technology or a specific application to it. So for me, there's something about maybe giving a template for what a grand challenge looks like. Perhaps we could be clear about that.
Just when you say challenge, sorry, come back. You don't mean Hive 3 and Hive 4?
No.
Nor do I.
No.
Okay, thank you.
But rise above the noise would be part
Hive
of
3
the
and
grand
Hive 4
challenge.
Yeah, I suppose I'd like to sort of respond, not that I've had direct exposure to that, but a good example of this is restaurants and individuals going to analyse a restaurant's quality. And previously that was a small select group, but recently the likes of TripAdvisor has basically changed that completely round in terms of now you're creating mass assessment of that information. So perhaps, if we're talking about open innovation, opening it up to what the market, in a sense, a market driver becomes. Now, the danger of that, of course, is that there'll be inherent bias with individuals, but it could almost give a very interesting vector as to where that template could be, that template for the challenge could actually come from. Right now, I would imagine most people will be going, suggesting they want to understand what blockchain is and AI. We always look at the hype cycle, which is a massive push in terms of marketing, and there's not much content and not much viability there. So I suppose, I'll be interested to understand what that is, and could there be a sort of TripAdvisor option there, and just sort of research focus.
Is this question here, yeah? And then,
Okay. My name is Usman Al-Kali. I'm a PhD student here in the Oxford Brookes University, and I am researching on university industry government interaction in Nigeria. My question is, Professor John talks about going back to the old tradition. If you look at most developing countries, especially in Nigeria, there is a lot of funding issues to the universities. Economies are dwindling. There is a massive increase in student enrollment, and infrastructures are decaying. So don't you think moving from the old teaching system into more entrepreneurial is better way to go? Because that way the universities would not only create revenue to sustain themselves, but they are also preparing students to be independent, because in Nigeria, students graduate and keep on looking for jobs in the public sector. They do not become entrepreneurs when they graduate. And that is putting more pressure on the public service. So every student that graduates end up in the public sector. How don't you think the entrepreneurial system is the better way to go?
John, maybe Mohammed and Rozana. Yeah.
Okay, I told I'll go to just a quick, direct personal response, and then no, what I hope I wasn't saying was let's go back. That's also not a clever thing, but rather let's remind ourselves of the strengths of the traditional role. Not least, universities are about teaching. That was why they were set up in the first place. Teaching is the wrong word. Facilitating learning. Let me be very clear. That says that there's a role which we should be sure we should treasure, because it's a good role. The process, I think, absolutely is ripe for change, not least in the directions you're talking about. I think entrepreneurial thinking, providing much more opportunities for experience and project-based learning, flipping the classroom, all of this opens up space, which then equips graduates with much more practical skills. Because the other thing, to take Mohammed's point, we did a major project in Tunisia. We had some fabulous students come through a really great modern program, hitting a system, a national system, where there was no absorptive capacity. They had no idea what to do with these great students. So the happiest ones are the ones who found jobs elsewhere in the world. So that's terribly wrong for the country. We want them to bring that energy in. So absolutely agree with you. I think the role is one we should treasure. The process is one we absolutely should innovate.
Yeah. Just a very, very quick point, because you're talking of something that's quite close to my heart as well, where we have this recent trend, what with the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals and all that, to put as many people as possible into that formal education system and into tertiary education. And there's a real danger in that, I think, because you can tend to ignore the technical training, the vocational training, the entrepreneurial aspect. I mean, even if you look at the UK, if you look at austerity in the UK, in terms of education, one of the first things that tend to be cut in terms of expenditure is expenditure towards technical training, vocational training, non-university mainstream education-based training. Say the 1920s, for instance, there was this big post-war plan to encourage 14 to 18-year-olds to go into technical learning so that we can be a bit more like Germany in terms of having apprentice systems. But that was the first thing that was axed. The plans were axed, and then they came up again in the 1970s, a bit half-heartedly. And if you listen to Paul Johnson, what he said in a recent article in The Independent, I think, about his two sons. His elder son is very academic, and he just sailed through grammar school and is now in a great university, and his path is set. But then you're talking there about the top 10% of the distribution or 5% of the distribution. How about the rest? So his second son apparently didn't sail through schools, didn't have all these options when he was 11 years old, and he talks about how much they struggled, how the UCAS system is really good at channeling students into university, but how this non-university sixth form education, vocational training is really, really poor in the UK. And I know that it is extremely poor in countries like Sri Lanka, India, where university seems to be the only place that you can go to if you wanted to enhance your job prospects. And that's a real problem. I think we shouldn't only be talking about university, industry, government, but we really need to be looking at non-university as well.
And by actually just looking at universities as a way to get a job, actually what we are experiencing in most developing countries is that we are having too many universities, too many students who actually are not employable. You know, there is the economy of the country is not able to recruit these students. So we have this issue of number, but we also have the issue of quality, the quality of teaching, which is to some extent a bit neglected for financial reasons. Maybe I'll take this opportunity to come back to your question, if I may. I don't think we need more government intervention in the developing countries, because most of the developing countries that I know of are actually too much involved in running the universities, and the universities need somehow some sort of autonomy in order to be able to respond more easily to the turbulences and changes, because it's actually that dependence which is making the university too heavy and too slow to respond to changes.
I think we'll take one last question and then we'll bring it to close.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for this conference. I'm Datta. I'm professor of management innovation in Morocco in the university. I did teaching after 12 years in the multinational sector. I was in Procter & Gamble, Nokia, and I was also in Orange Telecom operator. And my intervention is like a testimonial of the Moroccan situation of innovation in Morocco. So 8 years ago, I got a simple idea. It's the number book platform. I don't know if you know that. Number book is just an application where there is persons who want its platform, who persons can do her emails, her phone number, just doctors, lawyers. And this can be alternative of call centers, wasting time, wasting energy. So I came with this idea. I want to register this idea. First of all, I got experts that are experts in several domains, but not in telecom. So the simple answers I got is just about form of the document. After that, I have to register this ID. I have to pay around $100 to register it. I think that poor people are not allowed to innovate in Morocco. After that, I got a big document to say, wow, I have an invention, it's mine. There is my name in this invention. 2 years after, I discovered number book. I said, this is mine. This is number book. I did it 2 years ago. I go back to the same office. They say to me that, yes, for sure it's yours, but it was just registered in Morocco, not elsewhere. Okay? And after that, I discovered that there is so many companies around the world, like Patent Straw, who can took some idea, innovative idea from different countries, and it's legal, 100% legal, and to launch them everywhere they want. So it's just the testimonials. It's mine.
Yeah.
First, you have to be rich. Second, you have to have person that can trust you. And third, you think that yes, you will register it. It's funny. You will have it in your curriculum, but it's stuck there. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's quite fascinating. Does that relate to something you were saying, Rozana? The lack of intellectual property can be a major problem in some of the developing countries. Mohammed, would you like to?
I think I'm quite confused about intellectual property, at least in the countries I know of, because I know some managers or political responsibility in countries that I know of claim that they have quite a lot of patents.
Yeah.
But those patents, as actually we have this example, are not. When you go to the international database and you try to check that, you don't find the same number. You do find a very, very small, a very, very different number. So how it is managed, I think it needs to be looked at. Whether, the countries are not registered with the International Intellectual Property Bureau or I don't know, maybe the colleagues who are coming from Algeria could also give a point. But it's funny because I've heard, officials in Algeria, for instance, giving a very high number of patents, but when I wanted to check that in the international database, I didn't. I find a very, very, small number and a huge difference, a huge difference comparing to what they were saying.
Karl?
Yeah, I think I'd like to respond in saying that the inventor of the light bulb was Thomas Edison, but at the same time there was an individual in the US who also invented it simultaneously. It's Edison that we remember because he had the infrastructure and those around him that were able to support and gain that IP protection. This is where I argue universities themselves, with their infrastructure and their shell, an opportunity for sharing shared IP ownership or some kind of small incentive for them to support that. Perhaps that's where universities themselves could also position themselves.
Thank you. I think we are already running late. We need to bring the session to a close. I learned a lot. I think in all your very understated way, you said actually quite radical things. And there's a lot for us to reflect on. Thank you. So we are running a bit late, so we'll